you very much, Usman. Good afternoon. Congratulations to Zinshan and the team for this work. I must say that this is one of my favorite books. If you come up and visit me in my new office on the 7th floor, you'll find that I have 2 books on my shelf, and it's 2 copies of this volume. Zinshan gave it to me, I think the first day I arrived, and I have been a fan and a supporter of this work from the very beginning. So I'm really pleased to be here to be able to offer a couple of perspectives, but also at this kind of punctuation point in the process to congratulate the team and to reflect a bit on what this has helped us to do. And I want to do it from 2 perspectives. I want to start from the general, and that really reflects very much my new assignment as the director for the Consortium Research Program on Policies, Institutions, and Markets. We're thinking there about how to respond to the call of the reforming the new CG to make sure that our research is really relevant to the development process, and particularly as we do research in the areas of policies and institutions and programs related to markets. How can we make sure that that work is actually relevant to the real issues that countries going through the process face? So I want to reflect a little bit on what this work tells us about that. But then I want to go to a specific reflection on one of the case studies. And actually, we didn't compare notes beforehand. We weren't well enough organized. But the case study that I chose was Rwanda. So, so that will also have a little bit of common thread with our comments. Now, I was struck as I looked at this volume, this work, from the hindsight of seeing it completed, that it went through really basically exactly the process that we are now encouraging all of our policy-oriented research to do in order to assure that it is relevant. And the team went through basically a decision tree, which we're trying to make explicit now for the new work that we're going to undertake, so that we can make choices about, is this where we want to put our efforts, or do we want to put them somewhere else? And that decision tree goes something like the following. We first ask the question, what is the policy or institutional or other kind of constraint? What's the blockage that is impeding the development or the improved opportunities for small producers and small consumers? So what's the problem? Let's make sure that we have defined it. Then we ask, is there a solution? What's the nature of the solution to that problem? Can we understand how that problem might be addressed in a very practical way? And once we understand what the nature of the solution is, then we have to ask, is it politically feasible to actually solve that problem? There are some problems that are really important in the development landscape, but if it's politically basically off the table that anybody is going to do anything about those problems, then we might make the decision not to do research in that area, even though we would like to learn more about, what's going on there. So again, a very important question, is it politically feasible to make progress in this area? And then if the answer is yes, then what is the process for moving ahead with that? And once we understand the process, then we have to ask, who are the agents who make decisions in that set of activities? Who really matters? It's not going to be us as the researchers. We can be helpful, but we aren't the ones who actually make the decisions. We aren't the stakeholders for the most part in those policy processes. So can we identify the agents? Can we identify the stakeholders? And then we approach them and we say, we can do research. We have some tools. We can help you with information. Do you need information? Do you want that? Would you like us to engage? If so, what kind of information would you like? How would you like it packaged? What is the timing of your need? How can we be of assistance? So basically, we make connections with those who are agents in the process to make sure that our information is useful and relevant. And if the answer to all of those questions is basically a go as opposed to a no-go, then we go ahead, we launch the research, we do it, and we engage and we make it relevant, and we stay with the process so that we understand how the research is used, and then we record the relevance and see what it leads to in terms of future research. So if you think about that decision tree, And you think about what the team went through in designing this research. Basically, they asked all of those questions together with the stakeholders, together with the CADUP process. That's what all of us from 2003 on were going through, asking those questions, getting the answers, and then saying, okay, how can we develop an information base which is relevant to move this process forward? So, as I talk about this approach to policy relevant research with colleagues who are in the consortium research program, some people say, oh, this is a very new way of thinking. We actually, in the past, have just thought about research and research products that can be published, and we kind of assume they'll be useful to somebody, but we don't necessarily think about this whole decision tree. So this is kind of new for us. But actually, this work is very helpful because it reminds us that it's not new for us. We have a number of products that have actually gone through this process, that have been designed and implemented in this way. And we find, in retrospect, that they've been very, very useful and very much appreciated. So I find that a very encouraging additional reflection on the work, which is quite new to my assignment since August. Originally, I just appreciated the practical utility of the work, but now I see that it actually helps us think our way forward on this agenda of policy-relevant research. So, having said that about the process, let me turn now to some specific reflections on one of the case studies. And I just at random chose Rwanda, but it turns out that I guess there's a historical reason for doing that, since I guess it was one of the first, and it's definitely worth looking at. But the question I asked was, okay, this is work that was done with data basically based on 2006 and a time series extending back from 2006, but it doesn't actually go much beyond 2006, because that was the constraint in the data, and because, as Zinshan has mentioned, the time to actually pull the volume together and get all the review and the publication. So we have a body of work that was based on simulation exercises and doing some projections about if this happens, if these decisions are made, then the outcome will, with some probability, be the following. So it's very useful for us to ask the question, from the hindsight of 2012, when the volume actually came out, looking back on the decisions that were suggested or the information that was provided in 2006, what actually happened? Well, the first thing that I think one recognizes in reading through that Rwanda chapter is that it's a kind of a cautionary note to recognize the time lags in this policy-relevant research. And if there is going to be a 6-year lag between the data and the information that we use and the time the message comes out, we have to condition the language very, very carefully, because if you read the text on Rwanda now, it's actually a very discouraging kind of message. It talks about poor performance of agriculture and slow growth rates and how things have to turn around. Well, actually what happened between 2006 and 2012 is that things did turn around. And so it would have been, I think, useful to recognize the possibility of rather significant change and to condition the language with that in mind. But that's a modest kind of statement about style. But it is the case that Rwandan agriculture did pick up very significantly in the period from 2006 to 2012. Now, I was a little bit surprised. I had expected higher growth rates than I actually saw when I went back and looked it up. The growth rate over that period was 4.9% for agriculture overall. Now, that's less than the aggregate growth rate in Rwanda overall. I think it's been more on the level of 7% or so, but it's also a little bit less than I would have expected in terms of agricultural performance, because we know they've had some very good years where the growth was considerably higher than that. And it's still below the 6% target rate. So even one of the best performing countries in the African experience is still struggling to, with very good programs, very well implemented and very significant investment, is still struggling to, get the growth rates up to the CADUP targets. I think that's actually a useful observation, but we should remember that the 4.9% on average from 2006 to 2012 is historically and globally a very high growth rate. So it's one to applaud. Now, perhaps part of the reason that they got these quite good results was because much of what was projected, or much of the relatively favorable scenarios that were presented in the work were actually implemented. The investment did come in at, they significantly increased public investment in the agricultural sector, around the 10% area. So there was indeed an increase in investment. It did focus on the staples, a lot of attention to maize, oddly enough, a fair amount of attention to wheat from a very small base, major attention to rice with not quite such good performance as in the maize sector. But in any case, there was a focus on staples and then on the root crops as well. And it did perform quite well. And because of that focus on the staples, poverty did come down. One of the major messages of the work is that a staples-based investment policy will have broadly based growth, and it will bring down poverty because of the nature of the distribution of production of the staples. And that's exactly what happened. The latest poverty assessment, I think, came out just in February of this past year. And the poverty rates went down from 59% in 2000 to 45% nationally in 2011. Now, of course, the rates are higher in rural areas. Those are aggregates. But that's a very credible, very respectable performance in reducing poverty based on a staples strategy. But it also shows the limits of a staples strategy, because as the country gets toward meeting the domestic demand for staples, then it becomes very important to have borders open in time so that products can flow when when there's excess or demand and supply come into play. And there Rwanda did hit some constraints on the trade in staples within the East African community and getting things across the borders. And so I think that's a very useful reminder as well, that if we're going to talk about a staples-based strategy, then we also have very quickly to bring in the trade dimensions of that and remind ourselves of what. Now that's in the chapter, it's there, but I think in reality it became a binding constraint. In a couple of years, it was very important. And then in addition, I think there is a little bit of additional thinking that could take place with regard to the role of the export crops. It is true that coffee and tea have very weak poverty linkages, and that was developed in the materials. However, if a staples-based strategy is going to run up against some limits in poverty reduction, then it's important to think about what exportables can smallholders produce. And there are a number of new ones that are showing up: pyrethrum, silk, essential oils from flowers, that sort of thing. And then you have a related set of issues of how can smallholders producing those things be well linked into markets. So, going beyond the staples message can be important. But then there's one other point that I want to just draw a bit of attention to, and then I'll step down. The work has a very creative approach to figuring out returns to investment when there really isn't a very good historical database that allows one to sort of pull from the empirical record what the returns to agricultural investment will be. So there's a very interesting and creative methodology developed and applied to look at the returns to alternative patterns of investment and to come to some conclusions about which would be more productive. That's a very important question that those designing the programs had to answer. And fundamentally, I think it's a good methodology. I think it was well applied. I think it has the constraint that the key assumption there has to do with costs of the investments, and you have to basically just sort of make that up if you don't have the historical record. So there are a lot of assumptions about what it would cost to do a terrace, what it would cost to do an additional hectare of irrigation, what it would cost to develop new seeds and do the agricultural research. And what we have found between 2006 and 2012 is that for some mysterious reason, those assumptions about the costs of fundamental investments were very much underestimated. As we look at the reality of what irrigation and terracing costs, as opposed to the engineering feasibility studies, which would have been part of the planning for this, they're way off. And so we really have to understand a little bit more about what's underlying these very high costs of production for the key investments which will move the agricultural agenda forward. So that, I think, takes us to the conclusion that it's great that this work is carrying on. It's important that it's not seen as a one-time shot, something that's finished. It goes on to the next round to digest, okay, this is what we thought might happen with these decisions if these, decisions were taken. This is what actually happened. What do we learn from that? And how do we then roll that into the next round of analysis and partnership with the stakeholders in this decision process so that they have the benefit of this new round of information and can move forward. So let me, on that note, congratulate the team for what's done, wish them great luck in what they're doing in the next round, and to say that I'm very glad to be in the position that I am now so that I can support you in that.